All right, greetings everyone. Greetings everyone. Tonight is about imperialism. I am one of the co-hosts of the webinar, Keenan Lattimore, and I am the BAP South coordinator. And I'm here with my comrades Tyler, Tunde, and Caleb. And like I said, we'll be discussing what is imperialism. And as you see on this first slide, there is also other uh, other parts of the series. So like, what is neocolonialism? What is decolonization? What is self-determination? Will be after this webinar, and that'll be in the next couple of weeks. Next slide. So, like one of our comrades sent in the chat, if you could put your name, pronouns, where you're located, organizational affiliation, if any, and yeah, in the chat, introduce yourself. So like I said, my name is Keenan, pronouns he, him, his. I'm based in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I am part of Black Alliance for Peace, specifically BAP South. So to kind of get us started, I just want to ask you guys a general question. So when you hear the word imperialism, right, what is the first thing or the first things that come to mind when you hear this term? This term has been thrown around a lot very recently, and I just want to see like where folks are at as of right now, before we get like really into like what is this term that we've been using a lot lately. I see British Empire, okay. United States and UK, okay. Dominion without, okay. Domination, okay. White supremacy, plundering, military power, Western colonization, past and present, and capitalism. Yeah. Full spectrum dominance and control. Violence, yes, yes. Okay. Genocide, greed, commodification. Okay. Yeah. Globalized cap. Yeah. So I think everybody, I think all the responses already like, yeah, you guys pretty much are getting at like what is imperialism. Um, Next slide. So yeah, when we talk about imperialism, right? The two people that kind of influenced the definition that was proposed for this webinar were Vladimir Lenin and W.E.B. Du Bois. So imperialism is quote unquote the highest stage of capitalism, as Lenin said, and imperialism can be seen as a expansion of capitalism on the worldwide stage and is a system of international finance where capitalist powers, whether it be countries, organizations, institutions, and corporations, have consolidated control over the resources of the world, markets, and lands. And so what this does is that it leads to conflict internally and externally. And when we say control, like typically this is happening in the global south. And as we go throughout this webinar, you'll see more and more how much the global south is imperative to the imperial project. Next slide. So one of our comrades in BAP, one of our comrades in BAP, who's also part of the AAPRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Anye Chitoya is speaking on what is imperialism, and it's about a 2-minute long clip. So yeah, go ahead, start the video. Oh, there's no sound.
Of the communists on Facebook or Twitter. So what
is
imperialism? What is imperialism? You have perhaps heard that word before. Maybe you are friends with lots of communists on Facebook or Twitter and you see them like ranting about it all the time, but it's like rare. Like I see like people use the word a lot, but it's rare that I see people define it, right? It's kind of like one of those words that's like thrown around, but not really ever clearly defined. So I'm going to make an attempt right now to define it in a way that is easy to understand. So imperialism is a policy or ideology of extending the rule of one nation or empire over other peoples and nations for the purpose of extending the political and economic power of that dominating nation within those subjugated nations. It's basically a practice of extending political and economic access, power, and control through methods such as military force, that people sometimes call hard power. So basically just like sending in troops, sending in drones, sending in tanks, and being like, we are taking over your shit. We're taking over your government. We're gonna tell you what to do. Or through soft power. So rather than like outright invasion, rather than like boots on the ground, you are manipulating the economic system in such a way that the country is pressured to do what the dominating nation wants. Maybe you're sanctioning them. Maybe you're funding movements that are seeking to overthrow the government of the nation that you want to control. Maybe you are applying pressure in international bodies like the UN to isolate the targeted nation and get it to do what you want. But basically, imperialism is the practice of extending the economic and political power and influence of one nation, of the empire, upon other targeted subjugated nations, colonized nations.
And so this visual right here, although it says 1898, and this is before before we were all born, what it shows really is you have the United States, you have this big bird, right? And during this time, the United States was occupying the Philippines and other nations in the world. And even though it's in 1898, right, this still holds true in 2022, where the United States is now, well, it has been since post-World War II, the dominant imperial power of the world. And so this big bird could be like a double meaning in a sense that in the United States, we're told we have all this freedom and that the United States, exports freedom and democracy across the world, right? And that the eagle, I believe, is the symbol of freedom. But really, you have this big bird, which is like a vulture when it comes to these other nations. And the United States, with it being the number one imperialist power in the world, is definitely a vulture when it comes to the rest of the world. Next slide. And so what set the foundation for imperialism? Next slide. The 1884 and 1885 Berlin Conference. In the chat, can you put like a quick yes or no if you've heard of the 1884 and 1885 Berlin Conference? Yes. Okay. Yeah. And so this event right here is something that cannot be, left out of discussion. When we talk about the 1884, 1885 Berlin Conference, this was in late 1884 and ended around early 1885. And basically what it was it was 13 European countries and the United States included meeting together to basically decide on how Africa would be divided, and which ultimately led to the scramble of Africa, or as some people call it, the quote unquote new age of imperialism. This was organized by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And yeah, so like I said, there were 14 countries, but the main countries that were really discussed during this time period was Belgium, Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And so one figure that really stands out from this point in time is King Leopold II. Now, we often hear a lot of times about Adolf Hitler and how Adolf Hitler was like the most vile man to ever walk the face of the earth. Well, King Leopold was equally, if not worse. King Leopold was the king of Belgium, and he personally wanted Congo for himself. And so what it was is that even before the Berlin Conference, right, he had these philanthropic fronts that basically was trying to project this image of like, oh, well, I just want to go into the Congo to civilize Africa. I want to go into the Congo to basically make Africa or the Congo like better. But what it really was his own personal goal of having his own personal property, which ultimately ended up being the Congo. And so much so that it ended up being called the Congo Free State. And there was nothing free about that because King Leopold was diabolical to say the least. And so with this, right, with this conference, each country wanted their own personal, colonies on the continent. And this led to artificial borders being created because the borders that we see on the African continent now was not always there. And to give you an example, right? So for example, Portugal wanted the entire continent of Africa, right? And obviously they didn't get that. But this leads to like a lot of conflict between the European countries and them wanting to build power and empires, which ultimately lead to World War I and World War II. Go ahead. Next slide. Yep. So this is a visual of what the Berlin Conference did. Yeah. So as you can see in 1880, those borders that you see in 1913 were not there. These borders, like I said, are artificial. They were the direct cause of European colonization. And you see each country got particular parts of the continent. And so this is the thing, right? In the 1880s, 10% of the continent was controlled by Europeans. But by 1913, 1914, 90% of the continent was controlled by Europeans. Yeah, next slide. And this is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois again. So he had an essay in 1915 called The African Roots of War. And so what he talks about is how basically how Europeans pretty much got their wealth is through the extraction of labor and resources from, the darker nations, the global south, as mentioned earlier, particularly Africa. And then what this was is that this led to economic expansion, not only at home, but also abroad. And also to satisfy the workers who are at home in Europe, they wanted their piece of the pie. And the only way you could actually satisfy the labor at home is to expand to other parts of the world, other markets, particularly in the global south. Next slide.
Oh, hello everyone. My video is disabled by the host, so I'm not sure if you're able to see me. Can y'all just enable my video? Let me see. Okay.
You should be, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello everyone, my name is Tyler. I am the lead project manager for the BAP South Central sub-region, and I'm based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I will talk a little bit about the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, the World Bank, and sanctions. You go to the next slide. So both the IMF and the World Bank were founded post-World War II at the Bretton Woods Conference. With the IMF, its goal was to regulate currency exchange and the rates of currency exchange. At the time, before Nixon took office, the United States dollar was backed by gold, and the main objective was that each country in the world would base its currency in relation to US dollar being backed by gold. However, once Nixon took office, he disconnected gold from the US dollar being a main role in the currency. And the IMF then pivoted towards issuing out loans to countries experiencing economic crises, mainly in the global south. Both institutions are headquartered in Washington, D.C. The IMF consists of 190 member countries. One main critique of both the World Bank and IMF is that one, the IMF is usually led traditionally by European. World Bank is led by an American at all times. And of course, the main issue with these institutions is the role of neoliberal capitalism and how it is wielded by these institutions over the global south. One example, or one policy rather, is called the structural adjustment policy. As I mentioned, the IMF's goal is to provide loans to developing countries, countries in crises economically, and so the IMF will provide the money to be paid back with interest. However, there are some strings attached with that loan. In order for the loan to be provided, said country has to, one, tank any pro-labor legislation and therefore have a free market. So the workforce in said country do not get protections. And if there are, they must be voided. On top of that, said government in crisis must cut any social spending, must let any external company invest in said country and open foreign investment. And these examples that I just listed are what defines neoliberal capitalism, a free market enterprise that is anti-labor, anti-global South, that benefits multinational corporations in the United States, as well as other countries in the global North. As far as the World Bank, its goal follows the same ideology. However, it mostly looks into funding various projects around the world. And we could continue to the next slide. So now we'll discuss sanctions. So sanctions are defined as commercial and financial penalties applied by one or more countries against another government, group, or individual. Usually, the entities in charge of these sanctions are the United States and its ally, imperialist ally, the European Union, or of course, other European countries in the West. And the main goal of sanctions is to prohibit other countries, including non-sanctioned countries, countries that don't have anything to do with the matter at hand, from trading with targeted country. This could take the form of blocked financial transactions, not allowing financial institutions to process them. One main example of this is the current SWIFT sanctions against Russia. For the Russian-Ukraine conflict, you see Visa and MasterCard in the country, and even some citizens not able to use Google Pay at the metro, for example. Other examples or other manifestations of sanctions could be that a government can freeze the assets of another country doing this, and taking it from earlier, they can block loans to US dominated institutions such as the IMF or World Bank. And the question it may ask is, well, how do these sanctions get lifted? Well, the United States will lift these sanctions if said country, using Global South, will concede to its political and economic demands, whether it's electorally, of course, like whether it's a certain resource. And therefore, because of that, these sanctions are perceived, these sanctions are unilateral coercive measures, as they are used to bully a global southern nation, an oppressed nation in the world stage. And usually in the absence of military intervention or military action, some might ask, well, sanctions are better or humane than military action. And the answer to that question is no, sanctions are not any better than military action. And overall can lead to starvation and death within the population, despite the talking points of it affecting government leaders. We can go to the next slide. Some of the impacts are food and water, medicine, research, and industry or economy in general. Yes, sanctions are an active war, as Erica pointed out. One of the first things that happens with sanctions is that the targeted country's currency will dramatically decrease. This happened with Iran a couple of years ago with food and water. As I mentioned, under a sanction, any country, even on the sidelines, is not allowed to trade with said country. And if they do trade, the United States will sanction them as well. So food and water are not able to enter the country, and therefore you see starvation among the population. Medicines are not able to enter the country as well, especially during COVID-19. One example of this is with Iran. They were not able to receive medical supplies that they needed to combat the crisis. With research, scientists are not able to collaborate with other countries and sanctioned nations as a result. And even for those nations that do have a market domestically, because of these sanctions, they're not able to import the necessary tools that they need to help harvest those resources. So, for example, Venezuela and Iran are not able to fully drill for that oil in the face of US sanctions. And the main goal of these sanctions are to destabilize, or a soft power tool to destabilize a nation and encourage regime change. However, in the news, you might hear that insert leader is doing it themselves, but what really is happening is these sanctions are causing this disruption, destabilization in said nation, with the end goal of encouraging regime change and installing someone that will do the bidding of the United States and other global northern nations. Currently, the United States is sanctioning 39 countries. 1/3 of those countries are African nations, and the majority of sanctioned nations are non-whites. And some more current events or current examples of the role sanctions play is, for example, the main example being Cuba. In retaliation for the Cuban Revolution in the 20th century, the United States had imposed an embargo that is still in place now. However, despite this embargo, Cuba has made various gains in the field of health. They were able to create a lung cancer vaccine and the transmission of HIV from mother to child. And even during COVID-19, send doctors to various nations of the world, including Italy, for example. In Afghanistan, despite military withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Afghan people are experiencing a starvation crisis, a humanitarian crisis, as a result of sanctions there. And in the face of this, Biden has actually stolen $7 billion in Afghan assets that could have been used to, one, on top of removing sanctions, could have been used to provide resources within the nation. And lastly, we have the African nation of Zimbabwe. Sanctions were imposed there in 2002 in retaliation for the people wanting to reclaim their land. And now we hear that because Zimbabwe refused to condemn Russia at United Nations per the US request, Biden decided to extend these sanctions for one more year. And as far as the contradiction of imperialism, we see that Cuba, despite this economic strain, they're able to make these health gains, while the United States refuses to do anything on the opposite spectrum on health. And we can go to the next slide.
All right, thanks y'all. My name is Tunde, and I'm a member of BAP South as well. I just wanted to pose this question. We can change this actually to, what do you think of when you hear like the term NATO, right? Like, if y'all don't mind putting that in the chat, right? Like, and I actually, yeah, what do y'all hear, or what do y'all think of when you hear NATO? Trade, says Kim. Appreciate that. Anyone else have thoughts on that? Military alliance that serves U.S. interests and empires, says Reed. Collaborative imperialism, Europe and U.S. violent world powers, North Atlantic Treaty or expansion, supposedly defensive alliance. Tomato, that to colonize peoples, terrorists. yeah, appreciate those responses. 3.5 million people to protect European hegemony, for sure. Yeah, I think a lot of that is accurate, and definitely was supposed to dissolve after the fall of the USSR. And yeah, definitely a way to enhance US imperialism post World War II. Appreciate that. But yeah, in BAP, we say NATO equals white supremacy, right? It is a structure of white power, right? These are European and Western countries, right? The US is in NATO, even though it's not in Europe. Anyway, I think, it's important for us to understand it in that light as well, right? That these are European countries that are kind of expressing themselves in this pan-European form, right? And are waging war on a lot of the colonized world. And so on this next slide, just have a few more things here. We also know that NATO is a criminal military structure, right? Like it's criminal because, originally it was supposed to follow the rules of the UN Charter when it was originally established in 1949. And, after the Soviet Union fell, they no longer follow the UN Charter, though that was their mandate. And the UN Charter also says that war is essentially illegal, right? So they're illegally waging war in many parts of the world through this military structure. There's no reason for any African or Black person or any colonized person really to support NATO. And so, we say that we need to demand that NATO be dismantled, that it be abolished. And as a structure of white colonial power, we understand the history of NATO in Africa and in other parts of the world, in the sense that it upholds colonialism, coloniality, and that was expressed through the Portuguese colonial holdings in Mozambique and Angola and elsewhere on the continent. We understand that there are anti-colonial struggles till this day that NATO is, suppressing. But I did want to play a clip from Kwame Ture, actually, who spoke on, NATO and how it operates. So I hope y'all can hear the sound.
Well, Russia and the Eastern Socialist countries have what is known as the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact is the same thing that NATO is. You have Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, all the Soviet socialist republics in this. So that's a jack. You know what you're talking about now. They're mighty powerful too. Now, NATO is imperialistic. Imperialistic. Warsaw Pact is socialist. They say they are. They say they are. They say they are. And these two groups, these two countries, in terms of sets of countries, who have dialectically opposed philosophies, are talking about coming together militarily. When they talk about European security, that's what they're talking about. That's all they're talking about. You hear them all the time talking about European security? That's what they're talking about. Now, it is very important for us, Africans and socialists, to understand how is it possible for a socialist system and an imperialist system to put their military might together. And if so, against what? Against what? Now, we have to examine that. They're talking about European security. Nobody's against European security. Europe should be secured. Everybody's in agreement. I'm for African security. I'm for Asian security. I'm for European security. It's a necessity. But this European security is not Europe geographically. You understand me? You understand me clearly? You hear me? It's not Europe geographically, because America ain't in Europe. You hear me? Canada ain't in Europe. You hear me? Australia ain't in Europe. You hear me? Iceland ain't in Europe. You hear me? They talking about white man security.
Yeah, so I guess I was premature in saying that, the U.S. isn't in Europe or whatever. But Kwame Ture really laid that out. We know NATO equals white supremacy, equals pan-Europeanism, and is just a militaristic expression of imperialism, right? And so in BAP, we also say that we oppose the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, like Erica put in the chat earlier. I think, it's important for us to understand, right, that NATO is this axis of domination, rather, is, the greatest threat to peace and human rights and social justice, on the planet today, right? And so when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about these forces that are, kind of enforcing this war on African colonized people, on oppressed people worldwide, right? And so that's why we oppose this axis of domination. And we think it's absurd for any, Black or African person to embrace the agenda of NATO, the agenda of the US or the European Union countries. And so that's very important for us to understand why, this axis of domination must be opposed. But yeah, I did want to pose a question to y'all. Oh, and I see some bad news in the chat. Daruba's sick. I saw there's actually a GoFundMe, I guess hosted by Community Movement Builders. I'm gonna try and find that and post in the chat so folks can donate to Daruba's recovery. We need to support our freedom fighters. But yeah, I did want to pose this question to y'all, right? Like, what do y'all know about the relationship between Africa and the West, right? The West being, the NATO countries, the US, the EU, Australia. I'm saying, like, what do y'all understand about that relationship between Africa and this axis of domination? I see Shanice said is parasitic. Any other thoughts about that historical relationship between Africa and forces like NATO and I guess other groups? It's colonial for sure. Yeah, coloniality and colonization in general. Erica, thanks for that. Lowell says the West plunders Africa. Rebecca says it's very predatory. EV, Africans provided free labor to build capitalists for imperialist wealth. I see Salifu said it's genocidal. Jordan, leeches. Brian, there remains a lot of neo-colonial economic ties between African countries and their Western colonizers, for sure. But yeah, I appreciate all of these answers. Amrit says extractive and genocidal, definitely. And I see there's a question here. But yeah, that all of that is accurate. I think y'all are on it. Violent, says Tamara, and Jonas says Africa provides cheap raw materials, which imperialism ensures through enforced low prices and is thus underdeveloped. African wealth is a source of northern riches. Keenan says France in particular would fall without Africa. Millicent, lesser two evils thinking. Leah Boggs, handmaiden of the US. Absolutely. Yeah, and I just have like a couple of points here on the relationship between NATO and Africa in particular, because I think, sometimes that relationship goes under the radar, though I think, people have been talking about it more since this Ukraine, Russia situation, that conflict. So NATO, moved into Africa in middle of the last century, and it was, trying to shift, colonial power from Europe to the US, right? Like, because NATO kind of serves US interests, though, there are a lot of European countries that play an important role in NATO. The US is obviously the dominant power there and the dominant power in the imperialist system worldwide to this day. And so NATO was important in bringing that state of affairs to about, essentially. And so that included, establishing military bases all over the African continent. And, it was really part of this, effort to prevent, the African masses from achieving their goals, right? Like, there are all these anti-colonial struggles going on at the time. And many African countries were fighting for independence from colonialism. And, NATO was actively fighting against that, as y'all have said, right? Like in the chat, I think y'all really pointed to this. So, NATO maintains military bases to this day, right? And so to this day, they present a serious threat to the African revolutionary struggle. I think someone mentioned the neo-colonial relationship that a lot of African countries have with the West, right? And I think that this is part of like NATO's ongoing presence on the continent, is part of that, as well as what Tyler and Keenan spoke to, as far as the financial and economic pieces. The military aspect is a key point or a key part of imperialism, right? And so I think as we think about NATO's history in Africa, and as we think about NATO just worldwide as being this force for white power, for pan-Europeanism, essentially, I think it's important for us to understand the context in Africa. And I think an earlier slide kind of pointed to, Portugal as a key example. But yeah, I think we should think about the basing system and just NATO's relationship with African militaries to this day, whether that means, training African security forces or giving them direction. I mean, I think it's important to think about that. And so on the next slide, we just, we're just wanting to present some of the Black Alliance for Peace's stances on this. And we say, the US and NATO out of Africa, right? Shut down AFRICOM, right? So, I mean, the BAP has an ongoing campaign to shut down AFRICOM and get the US out of Africa. And so I recommend folks check that out. There's a lot of work being done to really build a campaign and a popular movement, right, to end this parasitic relationship between the U.S. and the West and Africa, right? So I think that's an important piece. So just want to call that out, and then also speak a little bit about AFRICOM in particular, because AFRICOM has a pretty interesting relationship with NATO. Actually, it was a direct product of NATO, because the U.S. European Command, or EUCOM, is part of NATO, kind of, and it's obviously a U.S. structure, a U.S. military command that was originally responsible for U.S. military relationships with 42 African countries. And so, it was actually the European Command chief, right? Like the EUCOM commander rather, who, wrote a proposal for AFRICOM in 2007. I mean, I think there are other forces talking about, AFRICOM at the time, right? And how that was a necessary structure to maintain US and Western dominance militarily over the continent. But I think that's an important point. But just to give y'all some, a brief definition on the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM was established on October 1st, 2008, and its purpose is to use US military power to impose US control of African land, resources, and labor to service the needs of US multinational corporations and the wealthy in the US. And so, that kind of speaks to, its role, right, in the imperialist system, with the US being the premier imperial power in the world today. AFRICOM is one of a few different, military commands throughout the world that is, helping to prop up the US militarily and servicing the needs of the capitalists, of the imperialists, right? And so I think, it's an important structure for us to understand and for us to call for the dismantling of AFRICOM as well. So yeah, and I think this is just like a map that shows some of the I guess the bases, the activities, the trainings, and things like that AFRICOM was carrying out at a particular point in time. And I think this map is a little outdated. But I in my opinion, the pins would probably be even more widespread if we were to recreate this for the present day. Like, this is created, I think, in 2013 or 2014. So we need to make an updated version of this. But I just wanted to provide this to show y'all the extent of AFRICOM's operations on the continent. And, because we're Africans, we're Black people, we focus specifically on Africa because, I mean, as a Pan-Africanist myself, I think of, Africa is primary, right? Like, it is where, you know, it's kind of like the homeland, right? Like I don't consider myself an American or from the U.S. So I think it's important for us to see Africa is an important site for us to struggle around and struggle for the, you know, liberation and I guess independence of Africa from colonial or neo-colonial domination, from imperialist domination, really. So I just wanted to call that out. If folks wonder why we're spending so much time talking about Africa or AFRICOM. But yeah, and there are something like 11 U.S. military commands. So AFRICOM is just one of a number of military commands. There's like a Southcom in South and Central America. There's like a CENTCOM or Central Command in the so-called Middle East. There's the Indo-Pacific Command in like the Asia or in the Pacific region, I guess. There's like a Northern Command. Anyway, there are a number of commands, but I think looking at Africa specifically tells us a lot about how imperialism operates. So on the next slide, okay, we have this video that we're gonna play. It's kind of just like the BAP video that brings imperialism to our local context, right? So when we think about, let me actually pull this up. When we think about, you know, how does imperialism affect me, right? Like, I think a number of BAP members have talked about domestic imperialism. And I'm sorry, y'all, I'm not really looking at the chat as much as I should be. But yeah, I appreciate everyone on here that is you know, posting these great comments in the chat. I wish I had been reading through this as I was going, but yeah, I mean, we're gonna play this video just so y'all understand, you know, how the local and the national relates to the international, right? Like how our context as colonial, you know, subjects of the U.S. empire as colonized people in the United States, right, is or can be referred to as domestic imperialism. And while the video doesn't necessarily call that out directly, that's kind of what we're trying to point to by showing this. So I'm just gonna make this full screen and play it. And content warning, it is graphic. There's some very graphic images in here. So I guess look away or you know, I don't know. Do what you, maybe turn things off for the next 4 minutes. But yeah, I just wanted to share that as well.
The U.S. is birthed from savagery. Europeans committed genocide against native peoples and stole their land, all while kidnapping and enslaving native and African people to turn a profit. Now, over 400 years later, the United States is a massive empire. It has 800 military bases and at least a dozen colonies scattered across the globe. Ever since its founding, the U.S. has always been at war, and it's the only country in history to use nuclear weapons against people. At this very moment, the U.S. is engaged in at least 7 wars of occupation and regime change. The mission? To ensure U.S. businesses have access to land, resources, and cheap or slave labor. But the 1% also wages war against Black and colonized people in the U.S., just as they've done from the start. Police continue to murder, brutalize, and surveil Black people. Our communities are impoverished, starved of resources, and thrown in jail. All the while, police departments become more and more like occupying armies. And the military budget, well, it just keeps getting bigger. The Black Alliance for Peace was launched in 2017.
The Black Alliance for Peace, as an organization, committed to revitalizing the traditional anti-war positions of the black community.
The United States is the worst abuser of human rights in the world. If you look at the invasions, the proxy wars, the sanctions.
The powers that be are seeing a threat to the status quo.
It does not matter whether the United States government agrees with Maduro and his policies, because 6 million Venezuelans wanted him to lead them. As a sovereign people, they have a right to determine their own direction and future.
Everyone has a place in this movement. We must be organized. If we want peace, we have to be willing to fight for it.
Our campaign is no compromise, no retreat. Defeat the war on African black people in the U.S. and abroad. The campaign includes the demands to end police militarization, stop their training by the Israeli Defense Force, shut down AFRICOM, remove all U.S. military presence from Africa, defund the military, and close the 800 military bases around the world. Black people have always been the consciousness and change agents within this brutal regime. Now can be no different. We are in the heart of the empire, and we must remember our fight for liberation is connected to the liberation of black, brown, and working class people everywhere. It is time for us to stand up to oppose U.S. war and murder and defeat the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination. That is why the Black Alliance for Peace was founded. And that is why we need you.
Word. Yeah, so that's the video. Just wanted to give y'all a little bit of I guess an intro to how we see.
We'll reconvene for the classified portion of the hearing this afternoon.
I apologize, y'all. Just want to give y'all like an intro to how we see the domestic and the international as connected, right? And so that's really the end of my presentation. I know we were going to go to questions and everything, and so I want to give Keenan and Tyler a chance to answer these as well. But I see one question in the Q&A box from Kenneth Morgan, who says, let's not forget US dominant but not the only power in Europe, Germany, France, England behind US, Portugal, Spain, Poland, and Greece behind Germany, France, and England. Yeah, for sure. And I agree, that those are also imperialist powers. But in individuals in the US, I think it's key for us to focus on the US as the dominant power, and the fact that we are we have the ability to impact that, right? Like it's our tax dollars that go towards a lot of these programs, these military commands, a lot of these institutions that are oppressing the global South and extracting capital and profits from places like the African continent and Asia and the Americas and things like that. So I think because of our particular position, it's key for us to focus on the US, but you're absolutely right, Dr. Cam or Dr. Morgan, about that. So I appreciate that question. But yeah, I'll open it up to my comrades to answer the other questions. And I see one from EV. And Keenan, I don't know if you see that one and want to take it, because I know that was part of your presentation. Can you expand on why you said imperialism began in the 1880s and not earlier in the slavery era?
Well, yeah, not necessarily that it began in the 1880s, but kind of like to highlight the importance of the Berlin Conference and what resulted from that. So like when we talk about the slavery period, we understand that this was a transatlantic affair, but Europeans didn't really like investigate like the continent to that degree that they did with the Berlin Conference. And so what this did was this allowed for resources to be extracted more, markets to be expanded, markets to be open for European, colonization, which set the foundation for like, capitalism expanding to the degree that it did. which led to those two great wars that we know as World War I and World War II. So that's kind of like what I was trying to like touch on. But yeah, slavery obviously is connected to obviously to the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa. All these things are connected. But yes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keenan. And Erica added to that earlier question. Living within the empire, it is key we focus on the U.S., not to mention the U.S. strong arms, the U.K., France, and Germany, as we're witnessing now with the NATO alliance in Ukraine. Absolutely, absolutely. And then I see another question in the Q&A box from Michael Alexander. It says, what is your response to China and Russia is imperialist too? Which is a great question. You know, I think we were kind of anticipating that, and I had some convoluted answer about, you know, the global division of labor, right, and how it's actually I actually have a slide that I was like, should we work this in? But yeah, essentially, you know, this is like one way to look at it. They're much more, you know, nuanced and, well, not, let's not use the word nuanced, but much more detailed ways to look at this. I've seen a number of articles on like, is Russia imperialist? I like the one from the Monthly Review that maybe I can put that in the chat too. But essentially this slide kind of talks about, you know, how the global division of labor has seen, you know, the shift in manufacturing from, you know, the global north, right, to the global south. And so, you know, because of that, right, like a lot of the global north countries, which I would say, you know, are kind of within that imperialist system, they benefit from I guess the extraction or the you know, just the capital accumulation that results from this division of labor. And China and Russia are, especially China, right, like they are, you know, part of that I guess global south. You know, they're doing a lot of the manufacturing. They and I think Russia as well, like they're not so much like like they tend to export some of their resources, like the oil and the natural gas, but they aren't the ones that have like the capital to kind of dominate the world. So I think they're probably people who have much better explanations than I have just given, but I tend to utilize that points from different articles I've read, and I think I mentioned the Monthly Review article that I thought is pretty well written. But yeah, I would just say that China and Russia are not on the side of the other imperialists. I think they are kind of just you know, fighting to throw off the chains of colonial domination still, and kind of break out from being kind of like a developing country. So yeah, and yeah, I definitely Russia is capitalist, but I don't know that I think it's imperialist. But does anyone else want to answer that? Because I feel like I might have not given the most clear answer.
I mean, I'm kind of mixed myself, but I did want to like address. I think Daydon had his hand up early, and I see Kenneth has their hand up as well. So I'm not sure which one we want to address first.
Okay, and Daydon, I think you posted, you sent me a private message about that.
Yeah.
Daydon, you want to go first? Oh, and I don't know if we can even, like, do we have to make Daydon a panelist for him to speak?
I can give permission to speak, but I don't see Daydon here anymore.
Oh, okay, he left. Damn, we've waited too long. Yeah, let's see. And then I see there's another question in the chat as well, or in the Q&A from JD Dunlap. But yeah, I guess Dr. Ken, do you want to ask your question or make your comment? All right, let's try and address some of these other questions in the meantime. Actually, I'm gonna pass it to Keenan. Keenan, you want to facilitate the next couple of questions? Is that cool?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
All right, great, thanks.
I also see Erica as her hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add some context a little bit to what Tunde was saying about the global labor. I also put in the chat the interview that I had on Hood Communist Radio with Kim Miller, because we discussed a bit China and its relationship with Africa. And I think one of the best imperialism functions not just
Erica, we lost you after you said best.
Oh yeah, I thought it was just me. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know why. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I was saying the best way to probably understand and what we were discussing was the best way to understand it is through Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Because imperialism isn't just merely when countries export capital, but when countries export capital in a way that completely drains the resources through violent neocolonial hegemony. So when we talk about China and Russia, we have, like, when we talk about in comparison to like the US and those, we have to understand that a lot of their capital is through that violent neocolonial hegemony, especially through the expansion of Western hegemony. That's not what we see happening with Russia and China. So I just wanted to add that on. So I hope that helps or made things clearer for folks.
And I see Kenneth, you should be allowed to ask the question now.
Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think Russia is imperialist by nature of its invasion of Ukraine, and also its past historical relationship with the economy of with Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Cuba. So I have a little different opinion in reference to what Russia is and what China is. I don't think China is, fully or not yet imperialist, basically. So I don't think that there is I think that there's a big difference between China and Russia.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure if Erica's question was a question to what you just stated, Kenneth, but it might be.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering in what way does that equate to a neocolonial relationship? Because my understanding is that imperialism is not simply a military force. And we can argue, I mean, clearly Russia has a strong military force, but is it still extracting, using that force to extract in the same ways we understand the US or the EU? Because even in its relationship with Ukraine currently, is that one where they are extracting resources from Ukraine to, create the capital for Russia?
Yes.
In what way? That's what I'm asking.
Who are the oligarchs, so-called oligarchs? So basically, That's capitalism, capitalism, and imperialism, and also with this some of its Crimea, Kurdistan, Belarus, and Poland. No matter how significant they are in reference to being racist and this, that, and the other, but those are the kinds of relationships that they had with Russia. Even before Russia became the Soviet Union.
So currently today, Russia has those same relationships with Poland, Belarus, Ukraine.
Okay.
Because that's the question right now, right?
There are historical roots with all of this.
I understand that.
So basically, what happens is that it goes into today. For example, and I believe that a country like Cuba is twixt and in between. It's against invasions and this, that, and the other. And so I think that you have to look. I think that you have to look at the world in reference to capitalism and what that is.
Right. But what I'm arguing is that capitalism is not the crux, and because that doesn't necessarily mean that it's acting in imperialist ways. So what I'm asking currently today, because the Soviet Union is the product of a revolution, right? So wouldn't that change the conditions? And what we see Russia today is the product of imperialist powers. So I'm asking, so my question is, how Russia is today, does Russia have those same sort of relationships where they are extracting resources from those nations to expand Russia?
It wants to.
But okay, but wanting to and having currently is that's where I think that's the distinction that needs to be made, because I think that's where the confusion is.
Let's look at Germany and oil and gas.
I don't understand that because I'm going to wrap it up here, because I do think that we are probably taking more time than we should, because this is a whole presentation. But I do want to say the relationship that they have with Germany, to my understanding, was one that was a mutual relationship, not one that they were extracting something from Germany. So much so that Germany now has been, strong armed by the US to cut off the ties with that relationship, which is at the detriment of its people. So that's where I would not say that Russia is imperialist. I would not argue that it's not a capitalist nation. I would not argue that it's not a nation with a strong military force. But imperialists, I think that is where we need to really have some clarity about what imperialism, I mean, that's the purpose of this, right? This forum. But I think we do need to have what it looks like materially, because I know what you're saying about what it wants to do, what it wants to become, or what it would like to do. But when we're talking about it currently, especially in the conditions that we are in, I think it's necessary to talk about what we are witnessing. And so the question that becomes, are we witnessing an imperial relationship between Russia and these other nations? And I would say no.
Okay. Yeah, we kind of like just allowed that to happen, because I think that's healthy debate. Because these questions are going to come up. People are going to have different perspectives. But I do see a question in the Q&A Let me check. I think this is for you, Tyler. Why should Black people be concerned about the IMF and World Bank and connection to everyday life?
Okay, that's a great question. So usually the policy that you see the IMF, as far as like neoliberal capitalism, free market principles, are the same principles that affect the Black labor, the Black workforce in the United States, and as well as African nations outside. So I do think for that reason, we do have to, I do think that Black people here and elsewhere should care about the role that the IMF and the World Bank that they play economically in that sense. I hope that answered your question. Was it too short? I add more to it. So even for example, in one thing I didn't fully add on the IMF aspect was the fact that usually one thing the IMF asks of a country in crisis is to not protect its economy. Well, and then of course let outside companies take root there. And so because of that, that can override the sovereignty of African nations and the land that they reside on.
Okay, and I see another question. How do we combat narratives that frame imperialism, US military occupancy, and NATO as quote unquote defenders? So like, for example, when the US military was pulled out of Afghanistan, a narrative was formed that said the military was keeping the peace. Does anybody want to address that question? If not, I can definitely answer that question. So basically, like when the US I'm gonna say quote unquote pulled out of Afghanistan because the war in Afghanistan is not over. What ended up happening was that there was this narrative that like Biden was doing like the wrong thing. The media was like very pro-war and like very like pushing this thing of like the troops shouldn't have been pulled out. So basically what ended up happening was that afterwards, the sanctions that were already on Afghanistan and the international aid that Afghanistan is so heavily dependent upon, like we saw in a matter of like months of how Afghanistan has been crumbling. And when I say Afghanistan, I mean the actual people. So people are literally starving right now. I think Tyler touched on this earlier where the $7 billion in assets that Biden and America literally stole and divided amongst families of 9/11 victims, and then the other half going towards humanitarian aid, which is also another form of imperialism, which we didn't really talk about. But basically, what that was is that all 7 billion is supposed to go to Afghanistan and the people. But there's this perception that like if the money is going to Afghanistan, it'll be in the hands of the Taliban. So yes, the United States isn't actually defenders in this situation. They very much cause the situation in Afghanistan currently, and they're continuing that by these sanctions on Afghanistan. And like we said, sanctions are very, very harmful to the general population. And Salifu, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to jump in and give a little bit more context as it regards to the situation with Russia and Ukraine and provide an example of what we within Hood Communists look at as imperialism and how it affects the situation that we currently see today, right? So one of the things that's gone very under discussed is the role of the IMF and the World Bank in Ukraine. And so when we talk about the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States we don't like, I could go back at least 20 years, but even if we stayed within the same decade, right, we're talking about 2 US funded coups that overthrew a democratically elected president 2 times. The United States funneled millions of dollars into Ukraine in order to prop up a far right movement that deposed of a democratically elected president. And what those far right forces did once they took power in 2014 was to sign up Ukraine for IMF structural adjustment for the IMF structural adjustment program, right? So you guys already talked about what the IMF does. The IMF went into Ukraine. These these far right forces and this US implemented puppet in Ukraine basically signed a loan that destroyed the economy in Ukraine and ruined the day-to-day lives of Ukrainians, right? So we're talking about imperialism, right? We're talking about capital, right? We're talking about like we're talking about coups, soft power, hard power. So then those same far right forces basically for the past decade or so have been brutally repressing Ukrainian working class resistance. When you talk about Ukraine, you have to talk about the southeastern region of Ukraine, the Donbas region, Crimea, LDR and DPR. These regions, like they get thrown around a lot in US media and in US conversations as like areas that have been dominated by Russia or something to that effect. But all those things sort of like neglect the very brutal and bloody history of resistance in those areas against far right forces that have been Odessa, exactly, that have been implemented and forced upon the Ukrainian people by the United States, and how those people in those areas who are primarily Russian nationals, Russian speakers, have had no other support in the region besides reaching back to their home country and asking for military assistance. When we talk about those regions, we're talking about 15,000 people killed over the last 8 years, right? That these things did not make national news. They didn't make headlines. And so one of the things that the reason why I brought this up in terms of imperialism is to bring the IMF and the World Bank back into perspective. The IMF and the World Bank are tools, they are arms that the US uses to weaken countries. And so what we see right now, as much as it's being framed as a conflict between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine is a hollowed out shell. It has not been self-determined. It has not been a free country for at least 20 years, but I'm just talking about the past decade, right? It has not been a sovereign nation for at least the past decade. It's a hollowed out shell that's being used as a battleground between Russia and NATO forces. And it's very unfortunate, but in order to understand the story and to understand and tell the full story, you have to understand that the reason why Ukraine has been able to be used this way is that the United States facilitated the process of implementing a far-right coup that installed a puppet dictator that is willing to use the Ukrainian people for cannon fodder in a war. This is how we get here. And the IMF and the World Bank have played a huge part in this conflict.
Thank you for that context, Salifu. That was brilliant. There's another question in the chat. So the question is, did the presenters already review the contradictions of imperialism? I remember it on the slide, but not sure if it was discussed directly. Tyler, do you want to address that?
Sure. The question one more time. I think I missed part of it.
Yeah, the question was, did the presenters already review the contradictions of imperialism? I remember on the slide, but not sure if it was discussed directly.
Oh yeah. So let me do that one. So the contradictions that I mentioned were the policy behaviors on health during COVID-19 between Cuba and United States. So as I mentioned, Cuba currently has been under a embargo imposed by U.S. And despite that great limitation upon it, they were able to come up with various significant health outcomes, whether it's lung cancer vaccine, HIV, HIV transmission from mother to child during birth, and then now you see, at least at the beginning of COVID-19, you see them sending doctors throughout the world to provide their expertise in alleviating the crisis. And the contradiction is that Cuba, with a huge strain on resources due to the embargo, you see them able to show up and show out in regards to health, while the United States, with all the resources at its disposal, conquered through imperialism, they are not making those same gains in terms of COVID-19 or in general, as there is not universal healthcare or other policies that are people-centered.
All right, y'all got any more questions? All right, we got one more question here. Wouldn't international tourism then be a form of imperialism? And you all want to take that?
Salifu, go ahead.
Yeah, so on the surface, I think this is a great question, because on the surface, the answer is like, no, that's ridiculous, right? But in some ways, yes, it is. So the biggest way to understand that is that none of us really travel the world or have travel experiences sort of like at will, unless you travel, say, with like an organization that's doing a delegation or something like that. Most of what people in the US and the global north, in Europe, for example, when we travel the world, we have specifically curated experiences that are a part of our travel, right? And these experiences are curated by billion-dollar industries that are designed not to expose us to sort of the reality of imperialism in the countries that we're traveling to. Instead, they keep us sort of fenced in within this sort of rectangle or box of activity, where our dollars remain within the confines of the experience they created for us. And that we don't, so it's not even just about limiting our interaction, but it's also economically limiting the reach of our experiences. So like, yeah, people are saying like resort experiences. So yeah, tourism is a tool of maintenance for imperialist and parasitic relationships. So many people from the US like love to go to Puerto Rico, for example, and people go and you see their Instagram story and it's like, oh, they're having the best time. And unless you're like seriously tapped in, you would have no idea that like Puerto Rico is dealing with like one of the most insane economic crises of any massive land on the planet because of US imperialism, right? So it's a part daydream, part fantasy, but also part money-making scheme as well.
All right, we got another question. Is imperialism not the same as colonialism? Neo-colonialism, my bad. Anyone want to take that?
They're partners.
Yes. Okay. So I was gonna say, Kwame Nkrumah's book, Neo-Colonialism is the last stage of imperialism. So they're very much tied together. I'm gonna give like a quick definition of neo-colonialism, but I want to like more so leave that for like in 2 weeks when that will be actually be discussed. So neo-colonialism is like the newer version of colonialism where on the surface you have like what they call political power, but like you're very much being controlled by the same colonial forces that colonized you. So for example, we see this not only on the continent, but we also see this definitely domestically. So Eric Adams is a neo-colonial puppet. Lori Lightfoot is a neo-colonial puppet. Barack Obama was a neo-colonial puppet. That's just like a quick thing. Yeah.
Okay, we have this question here. This is a great question. Any resources for further study on imperialism, NATO, sanctions, etc.? I think like many members of BAP, we can drop some links in the chat and some book recommendations.
Black Agenda Report is a really good place to go to. Hood Communists as well. And of course, the resources that we have on the BAP website. And then also the AAPRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, on YouTube. And yeah.
All right, I think that's a good way to close. We just keep dropping these resources in the chat. Unless y'all have like any final say or anything like that.
What was it all the question?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. We really appreciate you guys coming, and also just want to remind y'all that this is a series. This is the second in the series. And if you want to come to the next one, that will be on March 28th, and it's going to be about neocolonialism. So what is neocolonialism? We talked a little bit about that at this one, but we look forward to talking way more in detail about that the next time around with Map and Doozy out of Greenville, North Carolina. So with that said, have a great night, y'all.